My name is Kojo, and I will tell you a story I once witnessed with my own eyes, one that reminds me that even in our darkest moments, life still holds surprises for those who listen. Many seasons ago, in the village of Adumesa, there lived a young man named Kofi. He was not a warrior, nor was he the son of a chief. He was a musician, one of the finest our village had ever known. His fingers danced over the strings of his kora, weaving songs that could make even the elders pause and close their eyes, remembering days long past. Kofi was not just a musician, he was the voice of our people. At night, when the moon was high and the cooking fires had burned low, he would sit in the village square, his kora resting on his knee, and play. He sang of harvest and hunts, of love and longing, of ancestors watching over us. The children would gather around first, their small hands clapping to the rhythm. Then the women, who pounded fufu in the mortar, would hum along. Even the men, returning from the fields, would nod their heads to his music. But one season, the rains did not come. At first, we thought it was a passing delay. But the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into moons. The river that had always nourished our village began to shrink. The land cracked under the sun, and the crops withered before they could bear fruit. Our cattle grew thin, their ribs pushing through their hides. The people of Adumesa, once filled with laughter, grew silent and tense. Kofi, too, changed. At night, he still played his kora, but the songs had no joy. They sounded like the dry wind that whistled through the empty fields. His mother, a kind woman named Abina, watched him with worry. A musician carries the spirit of his people, she told him one night. If your spirit wilts, so will ours. But Kofi could not hear her. His heart ached, and his fingers, once so light on the strings, felt heavy. What use was music when the world was crumbling? Then came the worst night of all. A fierce wind tore through the village, rattling the roofs and shaking the trees. In the morning, when the storm had passed, Kofi ran to the riverbank, where he had hidden his most prized possession, his kora, under the old baobab tree. It was gone. The flood had taken it. Something inside Kofi shattered. He stood by the riverbank, staring at the swirling water, his breath shallow. The instrument that carried his soul, his father's gift, was lost. Without it, he felt like a man without a name. That night, he disappeared. No one saw him leave, but the next morning, Abina found his footprints leading toward the river. The villagers whispered among themselves. Some said he had gone in search of a new life. Others feared the worst, that he had let the river take him, just as it had taken his kora. Days passed, then weeks. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I was walking near the riverbank when I heard something strange. A sound, barely louder than the breeze. A melody. I followed it, my heart pounding. And there, sitting by the water, was Kofi. But he was different. His clothes were torn, his feet covered in dust. Yet his face was alive, and in his hands, he held a kora, not the one he had lost, but a new one, carved from dark wood, with strings that glowed in the dying sunlight. He looked up at me and smiled. I found it, he said, his voice stronger than I had ever heard. I sat beside him, waiting for him to speak. After a long silence, he told me his story. After losing his kora, Kofi had wandered deep into the forest, beyond the places even the hunters dared to go. He did not eat, did not sleep, only walked, listening to the sounds of the earth. One night, he collapsed beneath a tall iroko tree, ready to surrender to the silence. But then he heard something. A song. Not from a drum, not from a voice, but from the river itself. The water lapped against the rocks in a rhythm too perfect to be chance. The wind whistled through the reeds, and the trees swayed, humming a melody only the patient could hear. For the first time in weeks, Kofi closed his eyes and listened. Then he knew. Music was never just in the kora. It was in the earth, the wind, the water. He had spent his life playing songs for the village, but now he had found a song within himself. With renewed strength, he gathered wood and vines, shaping them with his hands. He carved a new kora, each stroke guided by the whispers of the forest. And when he played his first note, it was as if the world itself was singing with him. He had been gone for 2 moons. When he returned to Adumesa, the people gathered, staring in awe. He walked to the village square, sat in his usual place, and lifted his hands to the strings. The first note rang out, warm and rich like the smell of rain on dry earth. Then another, and another, until the entire village was wrapped in his song. I will never forget what happened next. The sky, so long barren, rumbled. A cool wind swept through the square, And for the first time in what felt like forever, a single raindrop kissed the dust, then another, then hundreds, thousands, until the ground itself sighed in relief. The drought was over. From that day on, Kofi's music was never the same. He no longer played only for the people, but for the land, the sky, the spirits that watched over us. And when he played, you could hear the river's voice in every note. So you see, my friend, when life takes something from you, it is not always the end. Sometimes, it is the beginning of a new song. And if you listen closely, you might just hear it calling your name.